That was Lullaby by Ian Mocka Maloney there. And you're listening to the Red Book Show on Wexford New People's Movement Radio. Remember, there's a live chat feature on wnpmr.com where you can go on, ask us a few questions, or just insult us if you want it. It doesn't really matter. It all helps the algorithm.
We can handle it. Yeah.
So myself and Steve have been reading a factual book, a very scary factual book this week. Annie Jacobsen's Biological War, a Scenario, takes us into one of the most frightening possibilities of modern warfare, an engineered pathogen deliberately unleashed on a population. Drawing on extensive research and interviews with in-the-know people, Jacobsen explores the secret history of bioweapons, the science behind them, and what might happen if containment failed.
Yeah.
Steve?
This book is an easier read than I feared, but it's a harder read than I hoped. Not only because Annie Jacobsen describes the outcome of biological war in such dispassionate detail, but also because the ultimate goal of what she calls dual impact weapons of biological warfare may well have already been achieved by alternative means, in particular by behavior modification and disinformation. These goals include the unraveling of the fabric of society and creating episodes of unbridled chaos. Russia and B.F. Skinner showed the way to do this without killing most of the people in society. COVID coupled with disinformation showed the way was possible. Unleash an epidemic that kills some people, a great number, but still a small percentage of the total population. That, along with disinformation, will be enough to collapse public trust. Collapse public trust, and after that, one can gut a country like a fish, as Annie Jacobsen said, from the inside out.
Yeah, and the real horror is how little has to go wrong, really. These weapons already exist. This is all factual. They exist in biolabs around the world. A BSL-4 lab is used to study the most dangerous and fatal pathogens, often ones that have no known cure. And there are 51 of these labs worldwide.
That's with an incredible number.
18 more under construction. 25 of them currently in Europe, 14 in the US, 13 in Asia, 4 in Oceania, and 3 in Africa. And
it's worldwide madness.
It is. And she draws on a lot of stuff that I suppose would have sounded like science fiction before COVID. For example, the Wuhan BSL-4 lab was China's first. Even if it's not intentional, the chances of a release are huge.
Yeah.
And it's something, I think after reading this book, it really does keep you awake at night.
Well, the thing is, we can talk about whether it was intentional or it was accidental, but the result is just the same. And the same thing in the scenario in this book that happens in Russia. You know, some guy basically has a guilty conscience and for some unknown reason puts an explosive device in the lab. And in a sense, it was an accident. One person intended it, but nobody else intended it. And the results are devastating.
They really are. And unfortunately, there are many real world examples to choose from. That particular incident that forms the beginning of the scenario in this book is based upon an accident from the same lab facility in, I believe it was in Siberia.
Yeah, it's in Siberia.
Which happened in 2019. When a fire went through the building. Luckily, everything was cleared when the fire came through, so nothing was released. But just by the grace of God.
Just by the grace of God, exactly. Yeah. Well, Annie Jacobsen has written a serious work of real investigative journalism. She interviewed like 50 different authoritative sources. She has reams of documents, and it's a good old-fashioned investigative journalist work, which I really appreciate. And it's very readable. I mean, I really certainly wasn't bored reading it.
Certainly not.
It was a thick, heavy book, physically heavy book, and I thought, oh, how's this going to go? But I got through it just fine. She has a way of sending readers on a tour through the Russian and American research facilities and agencies dedicated to creating and countering weapons of mass destruction. And really the distinction between offensive biological weapons and defensive biological weapons pretty much collapses, because if they're doing work on defensive biological weapons, they can quickly convert them into offensive weapons.
Well, she definitely brings
Yeah.
us into a world where the distinction becomes uncomfortable. Scientists, I suppose, they need to understand dangerous pathogens, but their funding is coming from the military-industrial complex often.
Yeah.
Your friend Steve, who we often talk about, and you have a very nuanced opinion of him, Tricky Dicky, Richard Nixon, attempted to ban all biological warfare and experimentation on biological weapons in 1972. And we talked about this before the show, and I think you and I would both agree that he was probably in earnest.
I think he was in earnest.
And he probably believed he was successful because the Soviets signed up to this. Now, the Soviets never stopped.
No.
And do I believe that the US abandoned its bioweapons program in 1972? Absolutely not.
All the U.S. did was, like you were just saying a minute ago, they just changed the sign in front of the program from offensive to defensive.
Yeah.
But the program just continued.
Absolutely.
And you know how it is in warfare. The U.S. has the Pentagon, Department of Defense, or at least it used to be called that, before the Department of War, some sort of new name. But the point is you have a Department of Defense, they can do offensive things of war or defensive. I was really surprised, Wally, by the expansion of these facilities after September 11th. That was something I really didn't know about before I read this book. The mushrooming, the explosion of gain of function research, recombinant DNA, the whole bit, the BSL-3 and BSL-4 labs. She cuts through the jargon and makes it very clear and understandable.
So we talked about The Stand before the break. When I first read The Stand as a teenager, it was totally speculative fiction. I mean, no one would have believed, most people wouldn't have believed that something like that was possible. I probably would, because I like science fiction and like thinking about things like that. But most people would have thought it's just a story. Then COVID happened and it wasn't so fantastical anymore. No. And I think the next pandemic will begin in a society where, I suppose, which is carrying the political scars of the last one.
Yeah.
So the dangerous thing then, Steve, is will people comply with restrictions, and will they have any trust in authority? And I think that's one of the things that Jacobsen touches on a lot towards the end of the book. And she obviously shows the fear that the American government, and I presume governments around the world, have about that scenario. In fact, as Jacobsen puts it, they fear that more than the virus itself.
Yeah, well, I think the answer to your two questions is no and no. What were your questions again? Just about the...
Will people comply?
Yeah, no.
With any restrictions, and will they have any trust in authority?
No.
So
I just tied up the questions with the answers. Okay. Yeah. I was interested because I remember being a little bit horrified, or a lot horrified, back in the 1970s when I first read about the project was called the neutron bomb, this new weapon. And like with biological warfare, the goal was to kill the people and leave the infrastructure intact. That's exactly the words that Jacobsen uses. And it seems like with the dual impact weapons now, they've advanced here in postmodern times to neutralize whole populations instead of killing them. So, for example, if you can do behavior modification, you leave ordinary people sort of feckless and innocuous, and democratic leaders politically defenestrated, then a nation can basically just exploit another nation, exploit their resources. They can take away their sovereignty, and you can just milk another nation for gain. I don't think this is actually progress, though. Maybe it is.
I guess nuclear weapons and the neutron bomb they can be targeted at a particular area, whereas a biological weapon, and I think the reason the Americans or the British or the French or the Russians or the Chinese never actually used any of these tactics was because they realized that once it's out, the escalation will not be possible, and you will quickly lose control of your weapon. The dangerous thing that Jacobsen points out is that the real threat now is coming from I suppose cells of fanatical groups like Al Qaeda who have biochemists with them. There was a famous story she told of a particular female who was caught with plans for some seriously effective weapons to be unleashed in American cities.
I remember the panic over anthrax when they put this powder into letters that they sent to people in Congress and the Senate and around, just around the country. And I remember the nervousness about that. And that may have been part of what led to this new emphasis growing out of September 11th, this new emphasis on biological warfare.
We have a message just after coming in there from Eamon. Eamon says, I don't know if Jacobsen writes about this, but there is now a fear that advanced AI in the hands of a determined teenager with limited resources could develop and release a dangerous pathogen just for fun. AI companies are trying to prevent this, but their recent failures in containing their own misbehaving models would not inspire confidence.
No.
That's very true. And wasn't there that famous case in America of a guy, was it in Las Vegas, of a guy being caught with a homemade biolab in his garage?
It's just nuts.
That's where the threat comes from. Yeah. Small individuals and small groups, fanatics, rather than governments, I think, because I think governments have worked out this is an end scenario.
Yeah. I remember, Wally, you were sort of struck by the whole idea that the U.S. government was planning to survive no matter how dire an outcome biological war caused.
Well, I'm very interested. I've always been very interested in the USA's continuity of government plan. It's something that I would have, especially as a teenager and in the very early days of the internet, I would have researched heavily. I just find it fascinating. It struck me as fantastical, an almost science fiction idea to preserve the Constitution while most of your citizens die and survivors effectively return to the Dark Ages. And yet you have these people in a bunker somewhere saying, as Jacobsen points out, they have devolution where people will be sent out, lower level officials will be sent out to bunkers, and then in maybe a year, maybe 10 years, they'll come back to the reconstitution part and effectively set the American government back up again. But what will be left? And how can you bring a society that has been through a decade of the Dark Ages back to democracy?
I think that's pure futility. I don't think it would happen.
I remember, I know I'm going off topic here. There's a famous Channel 4 production in the 1980s called Threads about a nuclear war. And in that, they took heavily from the British government's plan, which of course wasn't really a plan. It was just something to try and reassure citizens. At the highest level of the British government, they knew if there was a full-scale nuclear war, they were finished, and Britain would be plunged back to the Dark Ages. There was no way. Like the idea of taking the doors off the hinges and lying underneath them with a couple of pillows wasn't going to save you.
No.
But part of that was that different regional councils would be set up in bunkers, and they would try to control the distribution of food and medicine. And we followed one of those groups around Sheffield, and the building they were in came down on their heads. So they were trapped in the building. And in the end, spoiler alert, they all suffocated in that basement. And it's the futility of it, as you said.
Yeah. I have my own story here. I was not surprised at all to read about the continuity of government scheme. And my memory on this is a little bit hazy, but in the early 1980s, once again, I'm telling a story about my days at the Denton Record Chronicle in Denton, Texas, USA. As a journalist, I was invited by local FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Administration director, to go to the facility that was located a few miles out of the city in Denton County. And it was basically, he was demonstrating for me, the theme he wanted to emphasize to me was that the U.S. would have continuity of government no matter what happened in a nuclear war. And I didn't go to see the entire facility, but I was inside of sort of a bunker-like facility there in Denton. And I was told, probably not for the record, that the Denton facility that I was touring would be the site the president would go to in a national nuclear war emergency. It was a basement bunker set deep into the ground. And I remember looking at this ladder that was about 3 stories tall. I was a much younger man back then. And I climbed up this ladder and looked through this postmodern crow's nest from which I could imagine surveying and reporting down below. Look what's happening here. Everything is like cinders, and they would write a report. But you could survey the aftermath of a Holocaust, nuclear Holocaust unleashed by the weaponry. The words I used remembering it was chilling and it was knee knocking. I think my knees were shaking when I got down off that ladder.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, a very interesting message just in on the chat. And of course, if you want to send us in a message, just go to wnpmr.com. Join the conversation now. Liam texts us in. I remember the anthrax scare in Wexford. I got into crap trouble when the chief fire officer spotted me through the windows of the smoking room. Maybe Liam can clarify the situation here. Were you trying to release anthrax? That's interesting though. Certainly another time.
Yeah. So I could talk about another memory I have, which is basically this book goes through sort of in the middle part of the book describing the disintegration of society as the epidemic rapidly spreads and the ordinary people don't even know what's going on, and even some of the frontline people like the police force and people that are sent in to deal with people in Skid Row in Los Angeles, they don't even know what's going on, and the chaos is palpable. I was involved in a huge anhydrous ammonia gas leak in Minot, North Dakota, USA, by the derailment of a Canadian Pacific freight train. This was back in January 2002.
Yeah.
Now, this wasn't biological war. This wasn't like a spread of a virus, but I looked at the total chaos going on in a society in an emergency situation. So, first of all, the thing happened at about 2 a.m. That's when the accident happened. And most people were sleeping. And it was a very cold night. It was like 9 or 10 below zero Fahrenheit. And it was January in North Dakota, which was typical. Now, about 11 of these cars ripped apart, and one of them even flew up like a rocket and took off a corner of a house, like 70 or 80 feet away or 100 feet away, some distance away. And first of all, there was a breakdown in the whole civil defense system because the police department and the public safety unit was supposed to have this switch that would, somebody called in an emergency, all the radio stations would be notified and they would go into emergency broadcasting mode. But that switch failed. So all the radio stations were playing their regular programming during this entire thing, which was kind of farcical. And the next thing was there was no even distribution of information. So people in the know would phone other people and tell them about it. And some of the people that were most knowledgeable about the accident quickly got up on a hill away from the gas. But the people that were not in the know were still sleeping in their beds. Yeah. And there was a guy who was very heroic in doing this. My colleague at Minot State University, Jacobsen, started calling dozens of people and alerting them to this. And he called our house and told us, and he said, go to KXMC TV and listen to what the weatherman there says. Just turn your TV on and he'll tell you what to do. That was so important because you're going, what the hell is happening here? And you see the fog outside the house. It's a little bit terrifying, right? So turned on the TV and Schrader, I forgot his first name, he was on the TV saying, listen everybody, turn on your hot water, create steam in your house, go to the bathroom and sit in the steam because the steam neutralizes the gas. And when you run out of hot water, put wet towels in your dryer, disengage the vent, the dryer, so the dryer will vent right in your house or in your basement. Throw wet towels in there, continually boil pots of water. I was out there doing all this kind of stuff. My daughter and my ex-wife were safe in the bathroom. And so we were doing what we're supposed to do. And a lot of people were doing what they were supposed to do because contingency planning occurred. The fire department at Minot had already had a simulation of this at a workshop, and so they put the information through the TV station and saved a whole lot of people and prevented the city from getting buses to evacuate people in the dangerous hazardous ammonia gas.
Right.
But it was total chaos, and a lot of people were protected, but not everybody was, because they didn't have the key information. And I saw this movie. You may have read the book by Don DeLillo called White Noise. Have you heard of it?
Yeah.
I watched the movie on Netflix, and they had almost exactly the same thing. They called it an airborne toxic event. And I'm watching that movie going, oh, I lived through that already. It was the weirdest thing.
Well, we just have a message in from Liam there, just to clarify, just in case the Gardaí are listening in on this. Liam just wants to clarify that he didn't try to release anthrax outside the fire officer's building. He was working with the Department of Social, Community and Cultural Affairs and didn't hear the edict not to go upstairs. This was shortly after 9/11. The boss tore strips off me after the fire officer had dealt with him. That's incredible. And I can remember in that year after 9/11, there was a lot of anthrax scares.
Yeah,
People were very worried. With very interesting text in from Shane as well. Do you remember when the Irish government sent every household iodine pills in the event of Sellafield nuclear power plant exploding? I was around 10 years old and it scared me to my core. While my parents had long forgotten where they kept them, I used to routinely make sure they were there for a long time. I still have them to this day.
Oh my gosh.
I'm not sure if they'll work, Shane, but yeah, I can understand that. I can empathize with you there. I remember being a very young kid and watching a film on RT called I think it was the 4 minute warning or something. It was a play on that very remember the idea that the British government would have 4 minutes in the event of a nuclear war to warn people, and I was just a kid. I didn't understand the concept of nuclear war, but I understood it after that, and it scared the hell out of me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just going to return to a point. I told that long story to talk about the value of contingency planning.
Yeah.
Fire department saved a lot of people's lives. Not everybody's life, but a lot of people's lives. But here's the relevant point to that story. Contingency planning is vital. For example, after this train derailment, it was vital. I was saved from, and my family was saved from either disability or death because they were doing the right thing. But what Andy Jacobsen's book, Biological War, says is there's no such thing as contingency planning that works. If this virus is unleashed, every contingency plan that might be up there will just be futile.
Yeah, and yeah. I think like the British government's plan for nuclear war, it's interesting that and this book really comes from the perspective of an American, even though she certainly doesn't believe that the Americans gave up after 1972 too, and she also talks to a couple of Soviet biochemists who crossed over. But it's interesting that the main preparations of the American government seem to be in preserving their leadership and taking precautions against civilian disobedience rather than actually stopping the plague. They know they're not going to stop it. No. They know they're not going to save most people. And that's truly frightening.
Yeah.
It is. It really is.
So if you want to be uplifted, be sure to read this book. No, I'm serious, but if you want to be well informed, read this book. Actually,
it's an incredible book, and she doesn't shy away. I listened to her on a podcast recently, and the thing I like about her in this day and age is she refuses to identify. Because of course, as you well know, Steve, in America there are two political spectrums.
Yeah.
And she refuses to identify which one she sits on, and it's very difficult to know.
I admire that trait. I used to try to do the same thing in my classes when they have to guess, and I couldn't. I thought her politics didn't even really matter.
Yeah.
What mattered is this whole issue of biological war and whether the world should be kept safe from some of these crazy schemes.
And one thing she does point out, and she doesn't point it out in a conspiracy theory way, she doesn't point it out in it was their fault or it was some sort of nefarious plan. She has talked to a lot of people in the know, and her conclusion, and she claims their conclusion, is that there's no way COVID-19 was the result of somebody eating a bat in a wet market. When there was a BSL-4 lab right beside it, that was studying coronaviruses, and we're just lucky that it wasn't something more deadly that got out. And it was bound to happen. It managed to happen in China and spread around the world, but it could have easily happened in America or
anywhere.
in France or in the UK, and it'll happen again.
Yeah,
There's
will.
No doubt. Well,
on that note,
So you're listening to the Red Book Show. Summer is over, winter is coming. The possibility of a civilization-ending pandemic is always there. So sleep well. We're going to have a bit of music now. This is Roger Maguire with The Flight of the Earls.